Retirement. How should we think about the amount of money people should have for a healthy retirement and the risk that they should be taking? And what kind of systems should we build to help people manage their finances better as it pertains to retirement? So, when it comes to retirement, we usually ask two questions of savers. We ask them, how much of your final salary will you need at retirement? Usually, what percentage of your final salary would you need at retirement? And then we ask them, and what's your risk attitude? And we take these two numbers, and based on that, people in the financial industry optimize their portfolio based on those two numbers. But I want us to think about a deep question, which is, can savers truly answer these questions in a meaningful way? Not, of course, they can answer these questions, but can they answer them in a meaningful way? Specifically, do they have the knowledge and the expertise to answer these questions, or do these questions require knowledge and expertise that is so deep that it's professionals that should be answering those things for people and not individuals? Okay, so let's take these questions one at a time. How much of your final salary will you need at retirement? Actually, when you think about it, try to do this exercise yourself. What is the answer? How did you come up with this? I've been thinking about this for a long time, and frankly, I have to tell you, I just don't know. I just don't know what is the right computation. It has lots of variables that should come into it. Things like cost of living when I retire, cost of healthcare, how do I want to live, what will happen to Social Security. I mean, lots of things that I just have no idea about. There's some things I also know, but lots of things I don't know about. Anyway, so to study this, we invited people, hundreds of people, to come, different age group, different professions, and we asked them this question. And what was the most common answer we got? 70%. People basically said, I need to have 70% of my final salary at retirement. And then we pushed them and we said, how did you get to this number? And nobody knew. Nobody knew. And then we pushed them some more and some more. And eventually most people said, you know what? I have no idea how I got to it, but I think somebody told me that this is the right number. And I have to say that this is the same thing for me, right? I don't even know how to get to that number, certainly not quickly, but I know that the people in the industry are saying that it's between 70 and 80%. So if I had to guess, that's what I would give, but not because that's what I think is the right answer. It's because that's what I heard is the right answer. So then we took another group, and we didn't ask them what percentage of your final salary would you need at retirement. We asked them, how do you want to live at retirement? What do you want to do? How do you want to spend your time? What do you want to do? And then we computed for them what we think they would need at retirement. What was the answer now? 130%. Why? Because if somebody took 10 hours of your day, 10 awake hours of your day, and took you out of work is actually very cheap. When you're at work, you don't need to do much. We don't spend money. Not that we don't need to do much. We don't spend money. It's cheap. Somebody even pays for our coffee. If all of a sudden you had 10 hours a day, it would be like the weekend. All of a sudden we would spend much more money on activities, on travel, on all kinds of things. And just to be clear, 70% and 130 are really, really, really not the same number. So the first question is it responsible for us to ask these questions and use them as the starting point? The answer is no. We tell people the number is 70%, they spit it back to us. By the way, I'm not sure about this, but I tried to go back and find out how did we get to the 70%. And to the best of my understanding, it basically came from what people actually consume. So when people go into retirement and they have less money, they basically reduce their consumption and they use 70%. Not because that's what they want, but because that's what they have. The other thing, of course, is that people at some point finish their mortgage, and if the mortgage is 30% of their income, then it means that they have the rest left. But maybe those are the ways that we got to 70%, but 70% nevertheless, it's not the right answer. So is it responsible for us to ask people these questions and then use them as guiding lights for how much people should save? The answer is no. Okay. What we need to do instead is not to ask this question, but we need to help people. We need to, much like in our study, we need to take people by step questions and ask them to think about how they would like to spend their time, what they would like to do with their time, how they view their retirement. And it could be different, right? There could be people who enjoy long walks on the beach and watching TV, and could be people who enjoy the opera and good wine. And therefore their answers would be very, very different. Okay, so that's the first point. What about risk attitude? Do we know what's a risk attitude, and can we articulate it? Well, consider the following study. We took 6 portfolios from A- to D+, and the portfolios were either have very low risk on the left to relatively high risk on the right. And we showed people these portfolios and we say, what would you like? What kind of risk would you like to take? But we showed people different portfolios. Some people just got the 4 middle ones. And we tried to measure what kind of risk they would take. And this is the percentages. 27%, 23%, 33%, and 17% took the highest risk. To another group, we replace D with A-. So we made the whole portfolio, but the 4 portfolio less risky. Now, what we should expect to see is that the distribution of A should go between A and A-, right? Because presumably there were some people who were willing to spend less than A, who wanted to take less risk than A, and they would move from A-. And we should see category C having both C and D, because these are people who wanted to take more risk and they couldn't. They would take the highest risk possible. So that's what we should see. What did we actually see? We saw basically a shift to the left. Think about it. D used to be 17%, now C is 18%. C used to be 33, now B is 32. B used to be 23, now A is 30, A used to be 27, A- is 20. Basically, there's a shift to the left, right? Not what we expected. We certainly don't see that the 27% of A from before is now split between A and A-. In fact, A is just the same, and A- got a whole new market share and also almost replaces the same magnitude as D. Another group, we showed the 4 most extreme ones, the 4 highest risk portfolio. And what happened now, again, this lateral shift, 16, 31, 32, and 21. Just think about it. D in the original set was 17. Now D plus is not just a combination of D and D plus, but we have D is 32%, more than it was before in the first case, and D plus got 21%. Another way to look at these results is to look at C and above and B and below. C and more risk and B and less risk. And when we look at the original 4, which were A, B, C, and D, A and B together were 50% and C and D together were 50%. When we look at the shift to the less risk, we see that A-, A and B together were not 50%, they were 82%. And C, which represents the higher risk, was not 50%, it was 18%. And when we took the most extreme set of 4, we moved to something very different. All of a sudden, very few people wanted to take low risk, just B, and most people wanted much higher risk. Now, what this tells us is that people just don't know how to answer these questions, that people answer in a relative way. In a simple way, it says that if you want people to take more risk, just add more risky option to your choice set and you'll shift how people take risk. But in a deeper way, what it means is that we shouldn't trust these answers, because if we ask people this question, they give us an answer, but it's not necessarily anything meaningful. And therefore, we shouldn't ask these questions because they don't really represent much if we can so easily shift the responses up and down. So, can do people know, and can they articulate? The answer is absolutely no. The other thing I want to point out is that we ask often people about the risk with money, but the reality is that we should ask about risk in other things. We should ask people about the risk in consumption experiences. We ask about risk in money, but the reality is that people eventually take risk in things like housing and medical expenses and travel and food and all kinds of other things. And it turns out that if you ask questions about risk in different domains, people answer you very differently. Now, what we're expecting people to do implicitly is to think about all the risk in all the areas of their lives, housing, health, vacations, leaving money to their kids, and so on, and somehow aggregate this and give us the risk in money. The reality is that it's just not relevant. So not only don't people know the risk in money, but that's not even the right question. We should, if we ask about risk, we should say, how much risk are you willing to take in housing? How much risk are you willing to take in health? And so on. We also, for a really reasonable approach, need to ask people for their current wealth and their needs. Imagine two people that have the same risk attitude, but one of them is really far from reaching their retirement goals and one of them is relatively close. They should certainly take different risks regardless of what the risk appetite is, because what we should be thinking is about how much risk they need to take, not how much risk they want to take. And finally, as we mentioned before, people vary on their taste and what they enjoy. People have very different taste, and even though risk is not about taste in consumption, the way we should figure out how much people need and how much risk they should take should depend on what kind of preferences people have and how they want to live their lives. People who like fast cars and expensive vacations need different amounts than people who like camping. So what's the point? The point is that we often ask about risk as feeling, but what we need to do is we need to ask about risk as real needs. What do people really need? And therefore, we need to help them figure out what the risk. So right now, people tell us the risk and we say, okay, and this is how much you would get in retirement savings. What we need to do instead is we need to do a deep exercise of what people really want and need, how they want to live their life, what are the preferences, and so on. Then we as professionals should estimate the risk for them. The risk is not an input to the system, or shouldn't be an input into the system, it should be an output. Risk should come as a consequence of what people really want. People don't want to take risk, they want outcomes. We need to help people figure out what outcomes they want and then what risk they need to take as a consequence of that in order to get to retirement savings. So what system should we build? If we think about all of those elements, what system should we build? And I'm going to add a few more elements. The first thing is what we talked about. We need to get a more detailed and accurate picture of people's lives. We need to understand how much they earn, how far they are from retirement, how do they want to spend in retirement, how they view their lives. We need to price each of those things, and we need to help people figure out how much they need to, how far they are from achieving their goal, and what should their goal be. Or maybe the other way around, we need to help them figure out how much they need and how far away they are from that in terms of how much they earn and how far they are from this. But the first step should be, how do they want to live at retirement? Then we need to take other things like fixed life and health expenses. There's many things that people are just not good in estimating, and of course financial professionals should be much better at this. Understanding things like projected inflation, what's going to happen with Social Security or other retirement options, what's going to happen to cost of healthcare, what's going to happen to cost of housing in the city, out the city, and so on. So we need to help people with the things that are difficult for them to envision what they would need. The next thing is to realize that life is about trade-off. Think about kind of a graph that depicts the amount of consumption and how much happiness we get. And we have this diminishing return graph where the more we consume, at some point the graph gets diminishing return, and we need to figure out when are we in some acceptable level of those trade-offs, and when are we spending way too much, right? So imagine that we did this exercise for different domain of what is acceptable and what is accessible. And we said, what about how much are you spending on housing, and how much are you spending on coffee and vacation, and how much pleasure is it giving you compared to what you want? So this exercise is an exercise of understanding that money is kind of like the oxygen of life. And what we need to do is to figure out how we want to divide it between different activities. And for each activity, we need to figure where we are on this, right? If we're already buying lots of wine, maybe we're getting to the excessive point and we shouldn't spend more money on wine. If we're not buying enough cars or coffee or chocolate or whatever it is, maybe we need to increase our spending. So how do we help people understand this graph that connects the amount of consumption with happiness, figure out where they are in different aspects of life, and what trade-offs they should be making? What areas of life are we spending too much? What areas of life should we spend more on and less on? And that brings us to the next point, which is that we need to cut down on extra spending. We need to take the kind of things that we spend too much money on, that we get to the excessive point, and figure out how to cut. And we need to take the kind of things we're not spending enough on and spend more on them. The next point is about long-term view. There's something called the hedonic treadmill. And the hedonic treadmill is the idea that when we buy things, we get used to them. So here's what happens. Think about time on the x-axis and happiness on the y-axis. And what happens is that we buy something like new clothes, and we get really happy in the beginning, but then it goes down. And then we buy a new TV, and we get really happy, and then it goes down. This is the hedonic treadmill. And of course, the challenge with that is that we could get ourselves into a new level of high spending without getting much enjoyment from this. For example, imagine that we think that we should start buying more expensive cars or going to more expensive vacations. We start by deriving lots of value from this, but soon enough, we get used to this new level and we don't derive the same level of happiness from this. And I think that one of the role of financial systems should be to basically slow down the hedonic treadmill. What we should do is we should help people not increase their life expenses in ways that are not going to bring them as much happiness long term. The hedonic treadmill suggests that people get short-term happiness but not long-term happiness from different things. So one thing we could do is we could say, how do we help people buy the kind of things that would give them long-term happiness instead of short-term happiness? Sometimes we find that people enjoy experiences more than stuff. You're thinking of whether you should get a new sofa or go on a scuba diving trip. And you say to yourself, the sofa will stay with me for 10 years, the scuba diving trip will be just short. But the reality is that the scuba diving trip you would have a period of anticipation. Then you would have the week of the scuba diving trip, and then you would have a lifetime to think back about your new acquired skill, memory, and so on. Whereas the sofa is likely to be the same pattern as the new clothes here, when you get short-term happiness followed by adaptation. So we can help people not get into a new level of higher level of spending that don't give them as much happiness. We can help them figure out what kind of things have lower level of adaptation and how to spread things over time to get more joy and less adaptation. The next thing is we need to help couples. That's a very different story, but what we need to do is we need to recognize that the financial system is often a couple, not individuals. And in couples together are separate from two individuals separately. And we need to figure out, how do we get couples to express their preferences together, and how do we merge those in a useful way. Finally, there are some personality traits that I think we should measure. I think we should measure rationality IQ. To what extent are people able to think about decisions in a cold, calculated, rational way? And to what extent do we need to help people with those decisions? I think everybody needs some help, but the amount of help would vary by the type of rationality IQ that people have. There's the ability of self-control. to resist temptation. People vary greatly on that scale, and we need to think differently about people who have high self-control and low self-control and what kind of help they need. We need to understand the stress people have over money, and maybe for people with different stress, we need different strategies. By the way, I don't think that people who don't want to take risk with money should not take risk with money. They should just learn how to deal with the stress about this. And finally, we need to understand people's tendency to adapt, to get used to stuff, like to hedonic treadmill. One final point. So imagine that at the end of the day, you understand how much people should take in terms of risk and how much they should save. And I think that as professionals, we should help people figure out how to make trade-offs, how to take money and divert it from spending into saving. That's the first question, is what kind of sacrifices people should make in terms of taking what money they have now and moving into long-term saving, what kind of trade-offs they should make. And then we should figure out what risk people need to take. But then the question is how to report the risk. So imagine the graph on the left, and let's say that the green is some index, and the blue is some index, and the red is the way we've invested for a client. If somebody is going to see that compared to the S&P 500, the Russell 1000, they're going to be unhappy because the red looks below. But what if the red is below for a reason? What if the real depiction is on the right, where a client told us to take a small amount of risk, and indeed we took a small amount of risk, and there's a low return that comes with it, but we did it because that's what the client wanted us to do. That's what you would see on the right. So the final thing is to think very carefully about what we're trying to maximize for clients, and then how do we report in the same metric that we're maximizing. If we're really maximizing risk-adjusted return, let's not just report returns, let's report risk-adjusted returns, rather than something that is not the right one. That's it. I should say one last thing, which is in life, there are many cases where friction is not good, and we do lots of effort to try and reduce friction and difficulty and so on. That's not always true. Sometimes you want friction. In this particular case, if you have a question, feel free to email me. And this email is difficult on purpose because I did want to create some friction. So only if you're serious, email me about this. Okay, I hope this was useful. Bye.